Ironclad City had always belonged to the highest bidder. It was a place where power wasn't earned but bought, and where justice had long since become just another commodity. No one understood that better than Victor Langston. For 3 decades, he had turned the justice system into his personal playground, corrupting judges, buying off police officials, and ensuring that no case against him ever saw the light of day. His empire stretched far and wide, built on intimidation, wealth, and absolute control. No one dared to challenge him, not politicians, not law enforcement, and certainly not the courts. But this time, things were different. Judge Nathaniel Carter had spent years fighting against the very corruption that Langston embodied. A man of unshakable integrity, he had earned his reputation as the last honest man in Ironclad's justice system. He was the son of a single mother who had worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. He had clawed his way out of the city's toughest neighborhoods, putting himself through law school and building a career on a foundation of fairness and unwavering principle. In his 20 years on the bench, he had never taken a bribe, never caved to pressure, and never backed down from a fight. He had seen men like Langston before, arrogant, entitled, untouchable. And yet, this case would be his biggest test yet. When Langston entered courtroom 312 that morning, he did so with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he controlled the system. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, he exuded the kind of charm that had fooled people for years. He moved with the ease of a man who believed the world was his to manipulate, flashing a grin to reporters and nodding at his legal team as if the case against him was nothing more than an inconvenience. Judge Carter watched him with an expression of quiet observation. His dark eyes studied Langston as he strolled to the defense table, greeting his attorney, Victoria Shaw, with a firm handshake. Victoria was one of the best defense lawyers in the country, known for her ruthless tactics and her ability to dismantle even the most solid cases. Carter had expected Langston to come prepared. After all, the man never left anything to chance. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the courtroom stood as Judge Carter entered. Everyone except Langston. Instead, the businessman remained seated, checking something on his phone, his expression unreadable. It was a deliberate act of defiance, a quiet way of reminding everyone in the room who he was and what he thought of their so-called justice system. Carter didn't react. He simply took his seat, adjusted his robe, and picked up his gavel. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We observe certain protocols in this courtroom. One of them is standing when the judge enters." Langston barely looked up. "Apologies, Your Honor," he said, his voice slow and casual. "I was handling something important." Carter let the silence stretch for just a second too long. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down, the collective unease of the spectators, reporters, and legal teams. Everyone knew what this was, a power play. A game of dominance. And in Langston's world, he always won. "Stand up," Carter ordered, his voice carrying across the courtroom. Langston finally looked at him then, his lips curling slightly in amusement. But after a beat, he stood. It was small, barely noticeable, but Carter caught it, the flicker of irritation in Langston's eyes. He had expected the judge to let it slide. To hesitate. But hesitation wasn't in Carter's nature. Once Langston sat again, Carter turned to the prosecution. "Ms. Moreno, are you ready to proceed?" Elise Moreno, the lead prosecutor on the case, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Elise had spent months building this case, pouring through documents, tracking illegal transactions, and gathering every shred of evidence she could find. But despite her efforts, she knew what they were up against. Langston's money had bought him countless allies, and as much as she hated to admit it, the system was built to protect men like him. She had no doubt that he had people on the inside, police officers, government officials, even other judges. He had spent decades covering his tracks, and if they wanted to take him down, they would have to be flawless. She stood, clearing her throat. "The state will prove, beyond any doubt, that Mr. Langston engaged in extensive financial fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering over the course of several decades," she began. "We will demonstrate how his actions siphoned millions from city programs, pension funds, and public institutions, leaving thousands of people financially devastated." Langston looked bored. Elise continued, determined. "Through bank records, whistleblower testimony, and forensic accounting, We will present a case that not only exposes Mr. Langston's illegal activities but also reveals the network of corruption that allowed him to operate above the law for so long. At the defense table, Victoria Shaw adjusted her papers, already preparing her counter-arguments. She had defended powerful men before, and she knew how to manipulate the law in their favor. But something about this case felt different. There was a weight to it, an energy that made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way Judge Carter was watching them, his expression unreadable. Maybe it was the way Elise spoke, with the conviction of someone who truly believed they could win. Either way, Victoria wasn't going to let her client go down without a fight. As Elise continued her opening statement, Carter felt a shift in the room. He had seen it before, a silent war beginning to unfold. The prosecution, armed with evidence and righteousness, pushing forward. The defense, prepared to tear every argument apart. And Langston, sitting between them, smiling like a man who already knew the outcome. But this time, he was wrong. Carter knew corruption when he saw it. He had spent his life fighting against it, resisting the temptation that had consumed so many others. Langston had spent years controlling the system, bending it to his will. But in this courtroom, in this trial, he would not be the one in control. Carter picked up his gavel, bringing it down with a sharp, resounding crack. Let's begin. The tension in the courtroom had settled into a slow, steady burn by the time Elise Moreno finished her opening statement. She had laid it all out, point by point, exposing the decades of deception and greed that had made Victor Langston one of the most powerful men in the city. But the problem wasn't proving he had done it, everyone in that courtroom knew he was guilty. The real challenge was proving it in a way that the system, corrupted as it was, couldn't ignore. Langston sat with his hands clasped in front of him, his posture relaxed, as if he were listening to a mildly interesting lecture. When Elise took her seat, he turned slightly toward his attorney, Victoria Shaw, who didn't acknowledge him. She was too busy preparing her own attack. Judge Nathaniel Carter watched it all from the bench, his expression unreadable. He had been in this business long enough to know that men like Langston weren't just dangerous because of what they did but because of what they represented. They weren't just criminals, they were architects of corruption, the ones who had spent decades weaving their influence into every level of power. A trial like this wasn't just about justice, it was about challenging a system that had allowed Langston to thrive for so long. Victoria rose smoothly, straightening her dark grey suit, her voice steady as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we live in a time where ambition is often mistaken for corruption. Where success is too easily demonized. Mr. Langston is a businessman, a philanthropist, a man who has spent years building opportunities for this city. And yet, today, you are being asked to believe that he is a criminal." Langston barely moved, but a slow smile crept onto his face. The prosecution will present documents, numbers, witnesses, all of it meant to paint a picture of deception. But numbers can be manipulated. Witnesses can be pressured. And perception, she said, pausing for effect, can be distorted. Victoria walked deliberately toward the jury box, lowering her voice slightly. "What you will see in this trial is not a man who broke the law, but a man who has been targeted. Why? Because he is successful. Because he does not bow to political pressure. Because, quite simply, he refuses to be controlled. That is what this trial is really about." Judge Carter remained impassive, but inside, he felt the weight of every case like this he had ever presided over. The defense wasn't even pretending that Langston was innocent, they were shifting the narrative, turning it into a battle between the powerful and those who resented them. It was a common strategy in cases like this, make it about something bigger than the crime itself. Victoria returned to her seat, her face unreadable, and the first witness was called. Margaret Ellis, a former accountant for Langston's empire, took the stand. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, a woman who had spent years looking the other way, ignoring the discrepancies in the numbers she managed, until she couldn't anymore. Elise approached her carefully, her voice steady but soft. "Ms. Ellis, how long did you work for Langston Enterprises?" 22 years, Margaret answered. "And in those 22 years, what were your responsibilities?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her fingers tightening slightly. "I oversaw financial records, payroll, transaction reports. I handled offshore accounts and corporate filings." Elise nodded. "So you were familiar with Mr. Langston's financial dealings?" "Yes. Ms. Ellis, Elise said, pausing for just a moment, letting the courtroom breathe. At what point did you begin to notice irregularities? Margaret hesitated, glancing briefly at Langston. His face was impassive, but his presence was an unspoken threat. Carter saw the hesitation, the way her fingers trembled slightly. It's okay, Elise reassured her. Just tell the truth. Margaret exhaled slowly. 5 years ago. That's when I started seeing money move in ways that didn't make sense. Funds being transferred into accounts that didn't belong to any of our projects. Transactions disguised as charitable donations, but when I looked deeper, the money was vanishing into companies that didn't actually exist. Elise nodded. And did you bring these concerns to anyone? Margaret hesitated again. Yes. And what happened? Margaret looked down. I was told not to ask questions. Who told you that? Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Langston. The words fell like a hammer. For the first time, Langston shifted slightly in his chair, though his face remained composed. The jury, however, was watching him now, their expressions more focused. Elise pressed on. When you say you were told not to ask questions, was that a direct order? Yes. And when you continued to look into these transactions, what happened? Margaret swallowed hard. I lost my job. My severance was generous, too generous. And then, things started happening. My house was broken into, but nothing was taken. Just, my financial records were trashed. I started getting anonymous calls, emails warning me to let it go. A murmur ran through the gallery. Ms. Ellis, Elise continued, her voice gentler now, why are you coming forward today? Margaret's hands clenched together, her voice thick with emotion. Because I was a coward. For years, I looked the other way. I told myself it wasn't my problem. But I know how many people were hurt by what he did. And I can't stay silent anymore. Victoria stood. Objection. Speculative. Judge Carter didn't hesitate. Overruled. Victoria sat back down, but the damage had been done. Margaret had painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The jury had seen the fear in her eyes, the weight of what she had been carrying for years. And for the first time, Langston looked less untouchable. As Elise finished her questioning, she met Carter's gaze briefly. He gave her the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement that she was doing exactly what needed to be done. Victoria rose for cross-examination, and instantly, the atmosphere shifted. Ms. Ellis, she said smoothly, you say you worked for Mr. Langston for 22 years. In all that time, did you ever once report him to the authorities? Margaret hesitated. No. Victoria smiled slightly. And why is that? Margaret exhaled. Because I was scared. Scared? Victoria repeated, feigning curiosity. Or bitter? You claim you received a generous severance package. Could it be that you're testifying today because you want revenge for losing your position? Margaret shook her head. No. Victoria's expression remained composed, but her voice took on a sharper edge. Do you have any direct evidence, any emails, any recordings, that prove my client personally ordered anything illegal? Margaret hesitated, and Victoria pounced on the moment. No, she pressed. Just your word. Margaret's silence was enough. Victoria smiled. No further questions. Judge Carter watched the jury carefully. Some looked uncertain again, others conflicted. This was how corruption stayed in power, not by proving innocence, but by creating just enough doubt to make the truth seem uncertain. As Margaret stepped down, Elise cast a quick glance toward Langston. He was watching her now, his expression thoughtful, calculating. This was only the beginning. The courtroom had barely settled from Margaret Ellis's testimony when Elise Moreno called her next witness. The tension had shifted, a silent war playing out beneath the surface. Langston sat calmly, his confidence barely shaken, but Judge Carter could see it, the faint flicker of unease in his posture. He was still in control, but he knew that the case against him was slowly tightening. Elise's heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the witness stand. The prosecution calls Michael Trenton. A low murmur spread through the room as the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Michael Trenton wasn't just any witness, he was a former executive from Langston Enterprises, someone who had once been part of the inner circle. Trenton walked in slowly, his eyes darting toward Langston before quickly looking away. He was in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a nervous energy that clung to him like a second skin. As he took his seat, Elise studied him carefully. He was sweating. She waited for him to be sworn in, then approached. "Mr. Trenton, could you state your relationship to the defendant?" Trenton hesitated, shifting in his chair. "I was the chief financial officer at Langston Enterprises." "And how long did you serve in that position?" 17 years. Elise nodded, stepping closer. "So you were involved in overseeing the company's financial activities?" "Yes." "Including offshore accounts?" Trenton hesitated again. Yes." Langston didn't move, but the way his fingers tapped slowly against the table did not go unnoticed by Judge Carter. Elise's voice remained even. "Mr. Trenton, are you aware of financial discrepancies within Langston Enterprises?" Trenton's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He glanced at Langston again. "You don't need to look at him, Mr. Trenton," Elise said, her voice steady. "Just answer the question." Trenton exhaled. "Yes." "And when did you first notice these discrepancies?" His hands gripped the edge of the stand. "Roughly 10 years ago." A ripple went through the gallery. Elise let the weight of those words settle before she continued. 10 years ago, and you never reported it?" Trenton shook his head. "No." "Why not?" He hesitated again. "Because people who asked too many questions didn't last long at Langston Enterprises." Elise's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying people were fired for questioning financial transactions?" "Yes." "Were you ever asked to participate in covering up illegal activity?" Trenton's breathing was shallow now. "Yes." Langston leaned forward slightly, finally reacting, but Elise ignored him. "What exactly were you asked to do?" Trenton licked his lips. "I was instructed to reroute funds from company pension accounts into offshore holdings. The transactions were disguised as corporate expenses, construction projects, consulting fees, charity donations. But the money never actually went there." Elise took another step closer, lowering her voice just enough to force the jury to lean in. "Where did it go?" Trenton's hands curled into fists. "Into shell companies owned by Victor Langston." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the sound of distant traffic from outside seemed to fade. Elise held Trenton's gaze. "To be clear, you are stating under oath that the defendant directly instructed you to embezzle money from corporate and pension funds into accounts he controlled." Trenton closed his eyes for a brief moment before nodding. "Yes." A collective exhale spread through the gallery, followed by hushed whispers. Judge Carter glanced at Langston. His face remained composed, but his jaw was tight now, the fingers on his left hand tapping faster against the desk. This was the moment when the foundation of his empire had taken its first major hit. Victoria Shaw stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor." Leading the witness. Judge Carter barely looked at her. Overruled. Elise continued. "Mr. Trenton, did you personally profit from these transactions?" Trenton shook his head. "No." "Then why did you comply?" Trenton's voice turned quiet. "Because I knew what happened to people who didn't." Elise tilted her head. "What do you mean by that?" Trenton hesitated for a fraction of a second, then spoke carefully. "There were people who pushed back, who asked too many questions. And then, suddenly, they were gone. Not just from the company, but from everything. Jobs. Their homes. Their reputations. Sometimes worse." Judge Carter could see it, the way Trenton's fear wasn't just for show. He was terrified. Whatever he had witnessed over the years had left a mark on him. Elise let the silence stretch before asking, "And you believe Mr. Langston was responsible?" Trenton nodded. "Absolutely." The room crackled with unspoken tension. Elise took a step back. No further questions. Victoria was on her feet instantly, striding toward Trenton with the precision of a seasoned predator. "Mr. Trenton," she said smoothly, "is it true that you were granted immunity in exchange for your testimony?" Trenton hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Victoria turned toward the jury. "So, to be clear, the prosecution is asking you to believe the words of a man who committed financial crimes for years, without question, and only decided to speak when it benefited him." Trenton's face hardened, but Victoria pressed on. "You claim that people who went against Langston disappeared. Do you have any evidence of this? Any police reports? Any official complaints?" "No." Victoria gave a small, knowing smile. "Just rumors, then?" Trenton shook his head. "No, it was real." Victoria arched a brow. And yet, in all your years as CFO, you never once reported any of this? Never contacted authorities, never sought legal counsel? Trenton clenched his jaw. I told you. I was scared. Victoria's voice turned sharp. Scared? Or complicit? Elise stood abruptly. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Carter held up a hand. Sustained. Victoria sighed dramatically, turning back to Trenton. Just one last question. Did Victor Langston ever personally put a gun to your head? Did he ever physically threaten you? Trenton exhaled sharply. No. Victoria nodded, as if that answer had been exactly what she wanted. No further questions. She returned to her seat, and Trenton looked visibly shaken. Judge Carter addressed him. You may step down. Trenton left the stand quickly, his shoulders hunched as if he were waiting for something to strike him from behind. Elise sat back down, her face unreadable, but she knew what had happened. Victoria had done her job, planting doubt, twisting the narrative just enough to make Trenton's credibility shaky. But the damage had been done. The first cracks in Langston's carefully constructed image had been exposed. As the judge called for a recess, Langston leaned toward Victoria, whispering something under his breath. Judge Carter didn't hear what was said. But he saw the look in Langston's eyes. And he knew. The real fight was just beginning. The courtroom had barely settled from Michael Trenton's testimony before the recess ended. Judge Carter returned to his seat, glancing at the prosecution table where Elise Moreno was already reviewing her next move. Across the room, Victor Langston sat motionless, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the table. If he was rattled, he hid it well. Victoria Shaw whispered something to him, but he merely nodded, his expression unreadable. Elise rose from her seat, buttoning her blazer as she addressed the court. The prosecution calls Eric Fuller. A man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, walked through the courtroom doors. He had a presence, the kind of quiet strength that made people instinctively take notice. Dressed in a dark blue suit, he took the stand, his gaze shifting briefly to Langston before settling forward. As the bailiff swore him in, Elise wasted no time. Mr. Fuller, can you state your profession for the record? I'm a forensic accountant, Fuller answered, his voice steady. I specialize in financial crime investigations. Elise nodded. And how long have you been in this field? 23 years. During those years, have you ever been involved in uncovering fraudulent financial activity? Yes, multiple times. Elise clasped her hands in front of her. And in the past year, were you contracted by federal investigators to analyze financial records related to Langston Enterprises? I was. Elise turned to the jury. Mr. Fuller, can you summarize your findings? Fuller adjusted his tie, then opened a folder he had brought with him. During my investigation, I traced numerous wire transfers from Langston Enterprises into offshore accounts registered under shell corporations. These transactions were designed to appear as consulting fees or real estate investments, but the money never reached any legitimate projects. Instead, it was funneled into private accounts, many of which are linked to Victor Langston. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Elise gave it a second before continuing. Mr. Fuller, can you specify the amount of money that was funneled into these offshore accounts? Over the last 10 years, approximately $482 million. Someone in the gallery gasped. Langston remained still, but Victoria Shaw shifted uncomfortably. Elise let the weight of that number settle before she continued. And in your expert opinion, was this a legal financial practice? No, Fuller answered without hesitation. The movement of funds was deliberately concealed. The accounts were opened using falsified business names, and in several cases, large amounts of money were withdrawn in cash to avoid detection. These actions are consistent with financial fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Elise walked closer to the stand. And who was responsible for authorizing these transfers? Fuller didn't hesitate. The authorization came from Victor Langston. Elise let the answer hang in the air before speaking again. You're certain? Yes. His signature is on multiple financial documents, and in some cases, digital records confirm that he personally approved these transactions from his office computer. Elise turned toward the jury, pacing slowly. So you're telling us that the defendant wasn't just aware of the fraudulent financial activity, he was directly involved in orchestrating it? Fuller nodded. That's correct. Another ripple of conversation moved through the crowd. Langston's lawyers whispered among themselves. Victoria Shaw cleared her throat and stood. Objection, Your Honor. Speculative. Judge Carter glanced at Fuller. Do you have documentation to support your claim? Fuller flipped through his folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. I do. Judge Carter turned to Victoria. Overruled. Elise stepped forward. Mr. Fuller, you mentioned that some of these transactions involved shell companies. Can you explain what those companies were supposedly for? Yes, Fuller said, adjusting his papers. There were over 30 shell companies registered under different names, supposedly for services like private security, infrastructure development, and charitable donations. However, not one of these companies ever conducted any real business. They existed solely as financial conduits. Elise folded her arms. And who owns these shell companies? Fuller lifted his gaze toward Langston. Victor Langston and individuals associated with him. Langston's fingers stopped tapping. His hands folded together on the table, his expression unreadable. Elise knew she was getting closer to forcing him to react. She nodded toward Fuller. And did you find any evidence that these funds were being used for personal expenditures? Yes, Fuller said, flipping to another section of his report. Luxury properties purchased under fake business accounts, high-end vehicles, artwork, millions of dollars spent on assets that were never declared in any corporate filings. Additionally, there were personal travel expenses, including private jet charters, all masked as corporate retreats. Elise turned toward the jury. Let's be clear, this wasn't just about moving money around. This was about stealing from investors, employees, and the public while pretending to run a legitimate business. Fuller nodded. That's correct. Elise let the jury absorb that information before stepping back. No further questions. Victoria Shaw stood, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. She approached Fuller with slow, measured steps. Mr. Fuller, you make some serious allegations, she began. And yet, for all this talk of fraudulent transfers, have you personally ever seen my client move this money? Fuller met her gaze. No, I've only seen the transactions he approved. Victoria tilted her head. So, in reality, you have no direct evidence of Victor Langston physically transferring funds. Fuller's expression didn't change. I have documented proof of his authorization. Victoria smiled slightly. And yet, is it not true that executives often delegate financial decisions to lower management? Could it not be possible that someone within the company acted without his knowledge? Fuller adjusted his glasses. That might be possible, if not for the fact that Mr. Langston personally logged into secure systems and approved these transactions himself. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but Elise saw the slight tightening around her mouth. So you claim, Victoria said. But financial data can be manipulated, can't it? Digital records can be altered. Fuller nodded. Yes, but in this case, the records were backed up across multiple secured databases, including third-party financial institutions. The probability of all those sources being manipulated is effectively zero. Victoria exhaled slowly. No further questions. As Fuller stepped down from the stand, Judge Carter glanced at the clock. We'll recess for lunch and reconvene in an hour. The moment he struck the gavel, Langston stood up and leaned toward Victoria, whispering something harshly. She barely nodded, her jaw tight, before gathering her papers. Elise packed up her files, but her eyes remained on Langston. She knew that look. He was angry. And men like Langston, when pushed into a corner, became unpredictable. As she walked out of the courtroom, she had the unsettling feeling that the case was about to take a far darker turn. Elise walked briskly through the courthouse corridors, her mind racing with the weight of the evidence they had just laid out. The forensic accounting report was damning, but she knew Langston wouldn't go down without a fight. Men like him never did. As she reached her office, she shut the door behind her and exhaled, pushing away the exhaustion creeping up her spine. She had barely settled into her chair when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Frowning, she hesitated for a moment before answering. Elise Moreno. A deep voice came through the line, steady and unreadable. Miss Moreno, you need to be careful. She sat up straight. Who is this? I work in the financial sector. Let's just say I've seen the kind of power Langston wields, and I know what happens to people who get in his way. Elise's grip tightened on the phone. If you have information, I suggest you come forward officially. A dry chuckle followed. You and I both know that's not how this works. I just thought you should know that Langston isn't just worried about this trial. He's desperate. He's making moves. Watch your back. The line went dead before she could press for more. Elise lowered the phone slowly, staring at her desk. It wasn't the first time someone had warned her about a dangerous case, but there was something about the caller's tone that unsettled her. A sharp knock at the door made her look up. It was her paralegal, Nate. Elise, you need to see this. He stepped inside, holding up his tablet. The screen displayed a breaking news segment. Victor Langston's lead attorney, Victoria Shaw, attacked in parking garage. Elise's stomach clenched. What? She grabbed the tablet and hit play. The grainy footage showed a dimly lit parking structure, where Shaw was walking toward her car. Out of nowhere, a masked figure rushed at her, shoving her violently against the vehicle. The video cut off as security guards rushed in. Nate crossed his arms. They're saying it was a mugging, but come on. It happened right after she left court. Elise's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't a random attack. It was a message. But from whom? Langston? Someone trying to silence him? I need to see her, Elise said, grabbing her coat. Minutes later, she was in her car, heading toward the hospital. The moment she stepped through the automatic doors, she spotted a familiar face, Detective Andrew Holt, standing near the nurse's station. He turned when he saw her and approached. You heard? He asked. Elise nodded. How bad is she? She's conscious, Holt said. Couple of broken ribs, bruised face. She says she didn't see who did it. Elise exhaled sharply. You believe her? Holt gave her a look. I think Victoria Shaw is a lot of things, but stupid isn't one of them. If she says she didn't see anything, it's because she doesn't want to. Elise clenched her jaw. If Langston was behind this, it meant he was feeling the pressure. And that made him more dangerous than ever. She turned to Holt. We need to get her security. He nodded. Already on it. Elise took a deep breath before heading toward Shaw's hospital room. When she stepped inside, Victoria was sitting upright, an ice pack pressed against the side of her face. Despite the pain, she still looked composed. Elise, she said, her voice slightly hoarse. Didn't expect you. Elise pulled up a chair. What happened? Shaw exhaled slowly. I left court, walked to my car, and the next thing I knew, someone was slamming me into the door. That's all I remember. Elise studied her carefully. This wasn't random, Victoria. Someone sent a message. And I think we both know who. For a moment, Shaw didn't speak. Then, with a faint smirk, she said, maybe. Or maybe Langston's got enemies we don't know about. Elise wasn't buying it. Are you still representing him? Shaw's lips tightened. For now. Elise leaned forward. He's not worth this, Victoria. If you're in danger. I can handle myself, Shaw cut in. Elise sat back, watching her closely. You don't owe him anything. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Shaw's eyes, but she didn't answer. Instead, she simply said, be careful, Elise. If someone's trying to send a message, you might be next. That thought lingered in Elise's mind as she left the hospital. The weight of what she was up against had just doubled. If Langston was willing to use violence to protect himself, then this case had just turned into something even more dangerous than she'd anticipated. By the time she reached her office, another call was waiting for her. Elise Moreno? She didn't recognize the voice. Who's this? There was a pause. Then, you don't know me, but I have evidence that will put Langston away for good. Elise's heart skipped. What kind of evidence? Proof that he ordered multiple financial cover-ups. Records, recordings. I've kept them hidden. Elise straightened. Where are you? A heavy exhale. Not safe. But if you really want to take him down, meet me at the old train yard at 10 p.m. Come alone. A rush of warning bells rang in Elise's mind. This was reckless, dangerous. But if what this person had was real, it could be the breakthrough they needed. She tightened her grip on the phone. I'll be there. The line went dead. Elise sat there for a long moment, her mind racing. She knew Holt would tell her not to go alone. She knew it was a risk. But this case had already pushed her into deeper waters than she'd anticipated. And if she wanted to see it through, she needed to be willing to take the plunge. Elise checked her watch as she parked her car a few blocks from the old train yard. The meeting was set for 10 p.m., and she had arrived 15 minutes early to survey the area. The abandoned yard was a relic of the city's industrial past, rusted tracks, towering metal containers, and a distant hum of traffic from the main road. It was the kind of place where bad things happened in the dark. She pulled her coat tighter around her and kept her phone gripped in her pocket, her thumb hovering over the emergency dial button. The logical part of her mind screamed at her to turn back, to call Holt and let the police handle this. But logic had never won against her determination to uncover the truth. At exactly 10 p.m., she heard footsteps. A shadow emerged from between two containers. The man was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled over his head. He hesitated a few feet away, hands stuffed into his pockets. "You came alone?" His voice was deep, cautious. "Yes," Elise said, keeping her stance firm. "You said you had evidence." The man took another step forward, but his face remained hidden beneath the shadows. "I worked for Langston's company. Financial analyst. My job was to balance the books, or at least make it look like they balanced." Elise's pulse quickened. "And you have records proving he falsified them?" He nodded. "Everything. Offshore accounts, ghost companies, wire transfers. I have files that show exactly how he moved money to bribe city officials and law enforcement." Elise stepped forward slightly. "Why are you coming forward now?" He let out a dry laugh. "Because I finally realized people like Langston don't just ruin lives. They erase them. My old boss, one of the few who questioned him, died in a car accident last year. Since then, I've been looking over my shoulder. When I saw what happened to Victoria Shaw, I knew my time was running out." Elise felt the weight of his words. "Where are the files?" The man glanced around nervously. "They're encrypted on a drive. I can give you a copy, but I need protection. Witness protection. A guarantee that I won't end up buried in an alley before trial." Elise nodded. "I can arrange that, but I need to see the evidence first." The man reached into his pocket. Elise tensed instinctively, but when he pulled out a small USB drive, she exhaled. He held it out to her, but before she could take it, a loud crack split the air. A gunshot. The man staggered back, clutching his chest. Elise barely had time to react before another shot rang out. She dropped to the ground, heart hammering, as the man collapsed beside her, gasping for breath. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to move. She crawled to him, pressing down on the wound in his chest, trying to stem the blood. "Stay with me," she whispered. The man gasped, his eyes wide with fear. His lips moved, barely forming the words. "The drive, don't let them." Another gunshot whizzed past, shattering the side mirror of her car. Elise ducked low, grabbing the USB drive from his fingers. She didn't have time to check if he was still breathing. She had to get out. Heart pounding, she bolted toward her car, keeping her head down as more shots rang out. She heard the heavy thud of boots closing in behind her. She reached the driver's side, yanked the door open, and threw herself inside. A bullet ricocheted off the hood as she peeled out of the lot, tires screeching. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sped toward the city, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The drive. Whatever was on it, someone was willing to kill for it. And now, she had it. She needed to get to Holt. She took a sharp turn, tires screeching against the asphalt. She knew she was being followed. She could see the dark sedan in her rearview mirror, headlights glaring like predators' eyes. She had two options. She could try to outrun them, or she could lead them straight to the police station. Another bullet shattered her back windshield. Elise cursed under her breath and made her decision. She turned onto a busy street, weaving between cars, pushing her speed to the limit. The sedan followed, relentless. Her fingers tightened around the USB drive in her palm. She wasn't going to let them take it. She spotted the glow of the police station up ahead and floored the gas pedal. The sedan behind her suddenly braked hard, realizing where she was heading. Elise swerved into the station's lot, throwing the car into park before sprinting inside. "Detective Holt," she shouted. The officers at the front desk looked up, startled. Holt appeared from down the hall, his expression instantly shifting to concern. "What the hell happened to you?" he demanded, taking in her disheveled state. Elise's breathing was ragged. She held up the USB drive. "They tried to kill me for this." Holt wasted no time. He grabbed her arm and led her into a secure office, shutting the door behind them. "Tell me everything," he said. Elise took a deep breath, her pulse still hammering. I met with a former employee of Langston's. He had evidence, solid proof of fraud, bribery, offshore accounts. He said he needed protection. Before he could hand over the drive, someone shot him. Holt swore under his breath. Did he make it? I don't know, Elise admitted. I had to run. Holt sat back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face. And now they know you have it. Elise nodded. Which means we need to move fast. Holt took the drive from her hand and plugged it into his computer. The screen flickered as encrypted files popped up. A password prompt blocked access. He didn't give you a password? Holt asked. No, Elise said. He was too busy bleeding out. Holt sighed. All right. We'll get our tech guys on it. Elise ran a hand through her hair. This drive, it could be enough to put Langston away. Holt studied her carefully. Which means he's not going to stop coming after you. Elise knew that already. But she had come too far to back down now. I'm not scared of Langston, she said. Holt exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Maybe you should be. Elise met his gaze. I'm not. Holt leaned forward, his expression hardening. Then let's take him down. Elise sat in the dimly lit police station office, her legs crossed, arms folded, watching as Holt's tech specialist worked on decrypting the USB drive. Her body was still humming with adrenaline, her pulse refusing to settle even after she had reached the supposed safety of the precinct. The attack at the train yard had been too precise, too deliberate. Someone had known exactly where she would be and when. Langston had eyes everywhere. She glanced at Holt, who was standing near the doorway, speaking in hushed tones with another officer. His expression was tight, his jaw clenched in frustration. He was just as aware as she was that they were running out of time. The tech guy, a young officer named Reeves, let out a low whistle, shaking his head at the screen. This encryption is heavy duty, he muttered. Whoever set this up wasn't just playing around. Can you get in? Holt asked, stepping closer. Reeves adjusted his glasses. I can, but it's going to take some time. Elise's patience was wearing thin. We don't have time, she snapped. Langston's people already killed one person tonight trying to keep this buried. If they find out we have it, we could all end up dead. Reeves sighed. I get that, trust me, but brute forcing something this complex could take hours. Maybe longer. Elise dragged a hand through her hair, her mind racing. They couldn't afford to wait. She turned to Holt. What about Langston's old accountant, the whistleblower? Before he got scared off, he must have known something. What if he knows the password? Holt considered it. Bradley Mason, he said, recalling the name. We put out a warrant for his protection, but he disappeared before we could reach him. We need to find him, Elise said. If he has the key to decrypt that drive, then he's the only shot we've got. Holt exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. I'll put some people on it. He motioned for an officer to step in, giving instructions to track down Mason's last known whereabouts. Elise felt the weight of the drive in her pocket, as if it carried the weight of every crime Langston had committed. She had risked too much to let this slip away now. Holt turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You should lay low for a while. She shook her head. I'm not running. I didn't say run, he countered. But if Langston sent people after you once, he's going to do it again. And next time, you might not be lucky. Elise swallowed, knowing he was right but refusing to back down. Then let's make sure there isn't a next time. Holt studied her for a long moment before nodding. I'll set up surveillance on Langston's known locations. If he makes a move, we'll know. Reeves let out a small victory sound, drawing their attention back to the screen. I'm in. Elise's stomach twisted as she stepped closer, watching as a series of folders and files blinked open. Each one labeled with different dates, different transactions. Offshore accounts. Bribery records. Names. Lots of names. Holt leaned over Reeves' shoulder, his eyes scanning the screen. This is bigger than we thought. Elise could barely breathe. It's not just Langston, she murmured. It's judges, cops, city officials, he's been buying everyone. Holt exhaled sharply. No wonder people keep disappearing. Reeves clicked on one of the files, and a list of financial transactions appeared. Elise's eyes darted across the names. And then she saw one that made her heart stop. Holt. His head snapped toward her at the urgency in her tone. She pointed at the screen, at one particular name among the many. A name that didn't belong there. Detective Neil Carter. Holt's expression hardened as he stared at the name of his own superior. The man who had been overseeing the entire Langston investigation. That son of a, Holt's voice cut off as he straightened, pushing away from the desk. Carter's been feeding Langston information. Elise felt a cold dread wash over her. If Carter was working for Langston, then everything they had done so far had been compromised. He would have known about the USB drive the second they got it. He would know they were here. A sudden, sharp alarm blared through the precinct. Holt's phone buzzed. He answered it, his face turning pale. "What do you mean the security feed's down?" He spun toward the nearest officer. "Get everyone locked in, now." Elise's breath hitched. "They're here." The station erupted into chaos as officers scrambled to respond to the breach. The lights flickered, and Elise could hear the unmistakable screech of tires from outside. Langston's people weren't waiting for this evidence to reach the courts. They were shutting it down the only way they knew how. With bullets. Holt grabbed Elise's wrist, yanking her toward the back door. "We can't stay here," he said, urgency lacing his voice. "If they get inside, it's over." "But the drive," she protested. "We'll take it with us," he said. "Reeves, grab everything you can." Reeves barely had time to shove a backup drive into his pocket before the first shots rang out. The front glass doors shattered, sending shards spraying across the station. Officers returned fire, but Langston's men were ruthless. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to kill. Holt pulled Elise into the back hall, sprinting toward the exit. "We have to get to a safe house." She barely had time to process the fear, the adrenaline, the sheer weight of what was happening. Holt's grip was firm, dragging her forward as another gunshot echoed through the halls. And then the lights went out. Total darkness. Elise's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear movement, heavy boots thudding against the tile. They were in the building. A hand clamped over her mouth. Her first instinct was to fight, but then she recognized the familiar scent of Holt's cologne. He pressed a finger to her lips in the darkness, signaling for silence. Footsteps crept closer. She barely dared to breathe. The sound of someone cocking a gun sent ice through her veins. A voice, low and amused, echoed through the corridor. "I know you're in here." Elise felt Holt's grip tighten on her hand. Then, all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted through the hallway, deafening and relentless. The air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder as bullets shredded through walls and shattered glass. Elise ducked low, gripping Holt's wrist as they pressed themselves into the narrow space between a supply closet and the emergency exit. The station was a war zone. Holt tapped his earpiece, trying to reach backup. "This is Detective Holt. We are under attack at the precinct. Officer down. We need immediate." Static. The line was dead. Elise's heart pounded violently in her chest. She could feel Holt's rapid breathing beside her as they listened to the heavy boots moving through the station. Langston's men were hunting them. They weren't just here to make a statement, they were here to clean up loose ends. "Elise," Holt whispered, barely audible over the gunfire. "We have to get out of here." She nodded, her grip tightening on the USB drive in her pocket. It was everything. If they lost it now, it wouldn't just be their lives on the line. It would be every single person whose name was on that drive. Every officer, every judge, every corrupt official that Langston had bought. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway. Elise held her breath, willing herself to be invisible as a masked man stepped into view. His rifle was held low, scanning the area with slow, deliberate movements. He paused, his head tilting slightly, as if sensing their presence. Holt tensed beside her. The man took a step forward. Another. Then, a sudden gunshot rang out, echoing through the hall. The masked man jerked violently before collapsing in a heap. Behind him, Reeves stood, gun smoking in his hand. Elise let out a shaky breath. "Reeves. No time for thank yous," he muttered, jogging toward them. "We need to move. Now." Holt took the lead, guiding them toward the emergency exit. The building was still in chaos, but Langston's men had shifted their focus toward the main offices. If they could slip out before reinforcements arrived, they might have a chance. As they rounded the last corner, Elise froze. Standing by the exit, gun in hand, was Detective Carter. He was waiting for them. The betrayal still hadn't fully settled in Holt's eyes. "Carter." Carter smiled, shaking his head. "I told you to stay out of this, Holt." He sighed, as if genuinely disappointed. But you just couldn't let it go, could you? You're working for Langston, Holt said, his voice like stone. Carter shrugged. I work for the people who run this city. Langston just happens to be the one pulling the strings. Elise's fingers twitched, itching for her weapon. But Carter had the advantage. His gun was already raised, and if she moved too fast, he wouldn't hesitate. Drop the drive, Elise, Carter said, his voice calm. You're smart enough to know this won't end well for you. She swallowed, gripping it tighter. Even if you kill me, someone else will find the truth. Maybe, Carter admitted. But you won't be around to see it. Holt moved first. With lightning speed, he grabbed Carter's wrist, twisting the gun away. A shot fired, missing by inches. Elise and Reeves lunged, helping wrestle the traitorous detective to the ground. Carter fought like a man with nothing left to lose. He slammed his elbow into Holt's ribs, making the detective grunt in pain. Elise aimed a solid kick to Carter's knee, making him stumble. Reeves took the opening, swinging the butt of his gun into Carter's temple. The man hit the ground, unconscious. Holt rolled off him, wincing. We need to go before the rest of them get here. Reeves was already moving, pushing open the emergency exit. They spilled into the alley, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat of the fight. A black SUV sat idling nearby. Get in, Holt ordered. Elise didn't argue. The moment they were inside, Holt peeled away from the curb, tires screeching against the pavement. The city blurred past them as they sped through back streets, putting as much distance between themselves and the station as possible. Reeves glanced back. Where are we going? Holt's jaw tightened. Somewhere safe. Elise turned in her seat, her heart still hammering. Langston won't stop. No, Holt agreed. But neither will we. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. The SUV sped through the dimly lit streets, weaving between alleyways and back roads as Holt did his best to keep them off the radar. Elise clutched the USB drive in her palm like a lifeline. It was everything. The proof of Langston's corruption, the evidence they needed to bring him down. But right now, it also made them the most wanted people in the city. Reeves kept glancing at the side mirror, his gun still in hand. We can't just keep running forever. No, Holt agreed, his eyes locked on the road ahead. We take this to someone we can trust. Elise scoffed. Who? Every official in this city is either on Langston's payroll or too afraid to stand against him. There's one person who isn't, Holt said. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. Federal Prosecutor Naomi Ellis. Elise turned to him, skeptical. Ellis? She's been trying to nail Langston for years, but she's never had enough to make anything stick. Until now, Holt said firmly. This drive is what she needs. Reeves still looked uncertain. If she's as good as you say, why hasn't Langston taken her out already? Because she's too high profile, Holt answered. Taking out cops, reporters, low-level witnesses, that's easy to cover up. But a federal prosecutor? That would bring too much heat, even for him. Elise bit her lip. It made sense. Ellis had a reputation for being relentless, but she had never had a case strong enough to bring Langston down. With this, she would. Holt took a sharp turn, guiding them toward the outskirts of the city. The road was darker here, fewer streetlights, fewer people. It was safer for now, but not for long. Elise's mind raced as she tried to ignore the ache in her body from the fight at the station. Carter had been working for Langston all along. How many others were? How many cops, lawyers, and judges had Langston bought off? And if they did manage to get this evidence to Ellis, what guarantee did they have that she wouldn't betray them too? The distant hum of an approaching engine sent a shiver down Elise's spine. Reeves saw it first. We've got company. Holt checked the rearview mirror. Headlights appeared in the distance, moving fast. Too fast. They found us, Elise murmured. Holt cursed under his breath and floored the gas. The SUV surged forward, but the car behind them wasn't slowing down. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. The back window shattered as bullets sprayed the vehicle. Hold on! Holt shouted. Elise ducked, her heart hammering. Reeves fired back, his shots ringing out into the night. The pursuing car swerved slightly, but didn't stop. The driver was determined. We're not going to outrun them forever, Elise said, bracing herself as another round of bullets hit the side of the SUV. Holt gritted his teeth and yanked the wheel to the right, skidding onto a dirt road. The tires kicked up dust, blinding their pursuers for a few seconds. "Where the hell are we going?" Reeves demanded. "There's an old freight yard up ahead," Holt said. "If we can get there, we can lose them in the containers." More gunfire. The vehicle rocked as a tire was hit, but Holt kept driving, pushing the SUV forward even as it struggled against the rough terrain. The freight yard came into view, a vast, abandoned maze of rusted shipping containers and overgrown weeds. Holt didn't hesitate. He veered into the yard, weaving through the rows of containers. The enemy car followed, but they weren't as familiar with the terrain. "Out! Now!" Holt shouted as he slammed the brakes. They barely had time to grab their weapons before piling out of the SUV. The three of them sprinted into the maze of containers just as the other car screeched to a stop. Footsteps. Voices. Elise pressed her back against the cold steel of a container, her gun raised. She could hear them moving, spreading out. They weren't just Langston's men. These were professionals. "We need to split up," Holt whispered. "They'll pick us off if we stay together." Elise nodded. "Meet at the loading dock." Reeves gave a curt nod before disappearing into the shadows. Elise moved quickly but carefully, keeping her steps light. She could hear them closing in. She had to make it to the dock. If they lost the drive now, everything would be over. A figure stepped around the corner. Too late. The man lunged at her, knocking the gun from her hand. She hit the ground hard, the USB drive flying from her grip. The attacker was on her in an instant, pinning her down, his hands closing around her throat. Elise gasped for air, clawing at his arms, but he was stronger. She reached for her boot, her knife. With one last desperate effort, she plunged it into his side. The man stiffened, his grip loosening just enough for Elise to shove him off. She rolled, scrambling to her feet. The USB drive was a few feet away. Then, gunfire. Holt and Reeves had engaged the others. Elise lunged for the drive, fingers closing around it just as another shadow loomed over her. A hand grabbed her hair, yanking her backward. Pain exploded across her scalp as she was thrown against a container. The man in front of her sneered, gun aimed at her head. She was out of time. But before he could pull the trigger, a shot rang out, and the man collapsed. Holt stood behind him, gun smoking. "Move," he shouted. Elise didn't hesitate. She sprinted after him toward the dock, where Reeves was already waiting. They had the drive. They had survived. But this wasn't over. Langston would come for them. And when he did, they had to be ready. Elise barely had time to catch her breath as they sprinted through the freight yard, weaving between rusted containers. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, rapid footsteps, low curses, the unmistakable click of weapons being reloaded. "We need to keep moving," Reeves urged, glancing over his shoulder. "They're regrouping." Elise tightened her grip on the USB drive, knowing that losing it meant everything they'd fought for would be in vain. The freight yard opened up ahead, revealing the outline of an old loading dock. A single truck sat abandoned near the platform, its rusted cab blending into the shadows. "Up there," Holt directed, nodding toward the truck. "We can use it for cover." Elise and Reeves followed without hesitation, clambering up onto the platform just as a fresh burst of gunfire split the night. Bullets ricocheted off metal with sharp, high-pitched rings. Elise dove behind a stack of crates, her pulse hammering. "They're trying to pin us down," Reeves growled, peeking around the side of the truck. "More are coming in from the south." Elise's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off. If they didn't do something fast, Langston's men would box them in completely. She glanced at Holt, who was checking his ammo. "We can't fight them all," she said. "Not here." Holt gave a short nod. "We need an exit." "There's a side road past the dock," Reeves added. "If we can make it there." A sudden explosion of light flooded the yard. A vehicle had pulled in, its high beams cutting through the darkness like a blade. "T," Holt muttered. "That's not good." Silhouetted in the harsh glow, a group of men emerged from the vehicle. At the center stood a tall, broad-shouldered figure. Even from a distance, Elise recognized him instantly. Langston. He stepped forward with an air of complete authority, his voice calm but laced with a quiet menace. "You've made this far more difficult than it needed to be." Elise felt her stomach tighten. Langston wasn't a man who raised his voice or made a scene. He didn't have to. His mere presence was enough to send chills through even the toughest of men. Holt crouched lower, his jaw tight. "We don't have time for this." Langston took another step forward, hands in his pockets as if he wasn't overseeing a manhunt. "I assume you still have the drive," he said, his gaze sweeping the area. "Hand it over, and I'll consider being merciful." Elise's fingers clenched around the small device. Every instinct screamed at her not to believe him. Langston had no mercy, no compassion. He only saw people as assets or liabilities. "We're out of time," Reeves muttered, shifting his grip on his weapon. "We either make a break for it now or—" Langston lifted a hand, and his men raised their weapons in unison. Elise's breath caught in her throat. Then, suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening screech. From the far end of the freight yard, an engine roared to life. Everyone turned just in time to see a second truck barreling toward them at full speed. Langston's men scattered as the truck plowed through the yard, sending crates flying. Holt was already moving before Elise could fully process what was happening. "That's our ride," he shouted. Elise sprinted after him, dodging gunfire as she raced toward the truck. Reeves was right behind her, providing cover as bullets sparked against metal all around them. The truck skidded to a stop just long enough for them to jump onto the back. Elise barely had time to grab the railing before the vehicle lurched forward again, tires kicking up dirt. Langston's men recovered quickly. More shots rang out, but the truck picked up speed, swerving onto the side road Reeves had mentioned. Elise glanced back, breathless. Langston stood in the distance, unmoving, watching them escape. He wasn't chasing them. He didn't need to. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Elise gripped the edge of the truck as it sped through the dimly lit industrial district, her breath still uneven from the chaos they had just escaped. The wind whipped against her face, and she turned to see Holt in the driver's seat, his focus locked on the road ahead. Reeves sat beside her, pressing a hand against his side where a bullet had grazed him during the gunfight. "You good?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rumbling engine. Reeves gave a tight nod, his face tense. "I've had worse." The truck bounced over a pothole, and Elise steadied herself, clutching the USB drive tighter. It felt impossibly small for something that held the power to destroy Langston's empire. The drive contained financial records, payoffs, wire transfers, evidence tying Langston to corruption so deep that if the right people saw it, his entire network would crumble. But Langston wasn't the kind of man to let them walk away with it. Holt turned down a narrow street, slowing just enough to swerve around a cluster of abandoned vehicles. "We can't take this all the way to the safe house," he said, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "Too easy to track." Elise knew he was right. Langston's men would already be scanning traffic cameras, searching for them. They needed to disappear. "There's an alley up ahead," Reeves said through gritted teeth. "We ditch the truck and split up. Regroup in 2 hours." Elise hesitated. Splitting up meant losing the only protection they had, the three of them together. But staying on the move in one vehicle was too risky. Holt pulled into the alley and killed the engine. "Make sure you're not followed," he said, opening his door. "Phone's off. If you see something that feels off, don't engage. Just get to the meetup point." Elise climbed out, her fingers still wrapped around the USB. "Where are we meeting?" Reeves exhaled sharply. "Warehouse on 22nd. 3rd floor." She nodded. "Stay alive?" "You too," Holt muttered. Then they were gone, slipping into the shadows of the city. Elise moved quickly, weaving through the darkened streets. She pulled up her hood, keeping her head down as she blended into the late-night crowd. The city was never truly silent, distant sirens wailed, and the faint hum of traffic echoed between the buildings. She resisted the urge to check behind her. If Langston's men were tailing her, they'd be professionals. She wouldn't spot them until it was too late. She reached a crosswalk and finally stole a glance over her shoulder. Nothing. Just a couple of night workers, a cab pulling away from the curb, a man in a dark coat leaning against a lamppost. Still, her gut told her she wasn't alone. She turned down a side street, quickening her pace. The sound of footsteps followed. Not just paranoia. She was being tracked. Elise's heart pounded as she reached a narrow alley, slipping into the darkness. She flattened herself against the brick wall, holding her breath. A moment later, the figure appeared at the alley's entrance. Tall, broad, moving with controlled precision. Not a random pedestrian. One of Langston's men. Elise's pulse thundered as she took a slow step back, searching for an exit. The alley was a dead end. A rusted fire escape loomed overhead, too high to reach without making noise. She swallowed hard. The man stepped forward, his hand slipping into his jacket. Elise didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. She moved first. With a burst of speed, she lunged, grabbing a discarded metal pipe from the ground and swinging it with everything she had. It connected with his arm, sending whatever weapon he had clattering to the pavement. He grunted in pain, but recovered fast, throwing a punch that Elise barely dodged. She twisted, using her smaller frame to duck under his next swing. Instead of backing off, she closed the distance, ramming her knee into his ribs. He staggered back, but only for a second. His recovery was too fast. Langston trained them well. The man feinted left, then struck hard, catching her across the jaw. Pain exploded through her skull, and she stumbled. He grabbed for her wrist, but she yanked free, spinning toward the only escape route she had left. Up. She jumped, grabbing the lowest rung of the fire escape ladder. It groaned under her weight as she pulled herself up, fingers burning against the cold metal. The man cursed below her, already reaching for his fallen weapon. Elise didn't stop climbing. She reached the second floor, scrambling onto the fire escape landing just as a bullet ricocheted off the metal railing beside her. She ducked, heart hammering, then threw herself over the edge, grabbing onto a drain pipe. It wasn't stable, it creaked under her weight, but she had no choice. She shimmied down just as another gunshot split the night. The impact struck the pipe inches from her hand, sending a violent tremor through the metal. Elise dropped the last few feet, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot up her ankle, but she forced herself to run. She didn't stop. Didn't turn around. She just ran. By the time she reached the warehouse district, her lungs were burning, and her limbs felt like lead. She ducked into the shadows, pressing herself against the cold concrete as she scanned her surroundings. No sign of pursuit. She exhaled shakily. But this wasn't over. Langston's men were hunting them. And if they didn't find a way to turn the evidence into action soon, they would all be dead before sunrise. Elise pressed her back against the cold warehouse wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was still racing from the fight, and her jaw throbbed where the hit had landed. She touched her fingers to the tender skin and winced. No time to focus on pain. She had made it to the rendezvous point, but there was still no sign of Holt or Reeves. She checked the time. 15 minutes had passed since they were supposed to meet. Either they were delayed, or something had gone terribly wrong. She forced herself to think. If Langston's men had caught them, there would have been noise, sirens, gunfire, something. The city was restless, but nothing out of the ordinary. Which meant they were still out there. She hoped. Her grip tightened on the USB in her pocket. It was everything now. She just had to make it through the next few hours, and they could put an end to Langston's stranglehold on the city. A shuffle of footsteps broke the silence. Elise tensed, pressing further into the shadows. She slipped her hand inside her jacket, wrapping her fingers around the knife she had taken off the man in the alley. Footsteps grew closer, deliberate but cautious. Then a voice. "It's me. Holt." Elise let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding as he emerged from the darkened corridor, his gun still in hand. His shirt was ripped at the shoulder, but otherwise, he looked unharmed. "Where's Reeves?" she asked immediately. Holt shook his head. "Not here yet." A fresh wave of unease settled in her chest. Reeves was careful, calculated. If he wasn't here by now, something was wrong. Holt must have seen the look on her face. "Give him a few more minutes," he said, scanning the area. "If he doesn't show, we move." Elise nodded, but her grip on the USB tightened. Every second they waited was another second Langston's men could close in. They kept to the shadows, listening for anything unusual. The warehouse smelled of rust and damp concrete, the only light coming from the occasional flickering street lamp outside. Elise's nerves were fraying by the second. Then, finally, another sound. Heavy footfalls, slow and uneven. Holt raised his gun, and Elise gripped the knife tighter. Reeves stumbled into view. Relief was short-lived. His face was pale, blood seeping through the side of his jacket. He barely made it to them before collapsing against a stack of crates. "Damn it," Holt muttered, catching him before he could hit the ground. Elise was already reaching for Reeves' jacket, yanking it open to assess the damage. The bullet had gone clean through his side. Not immediately fatal, but bad enough that he was losing blood fast. "I made it," Reeves rasped, trying for a smirk. "Took a little detour." Elise swore under her breath, pressing her hands to the wound to slow the bleeding. "We need to get him out of here." "Forget that," Reeves groaned. "Did you get it?" Elise hesitated, then pulled the USB from her pocket. She held it up for him to see. Reeves let out a weak chuckle. "Then I can die happy." Holt scowled. "Not happening." He pulled a strip of cloth from his jacket and pressed it against Reeves' wound. "But we can't stay here. If you made it here bleeding like this, they could be tracking you." Elise nodded, shoving the USB back into her pocket. "We need an exit plan. Fast." Holt checked his watch. "I've got a contact 2 miles from here. A doc who doesn't ask questions. We get Reeves patched up, then move." 2 miles with an injured man wasn't ideal, but it was their only option. Holt pulled Reeves up, looping an arm around his shoulders. "You good to walk?" "Not really," Reeves muttered, but he forced himself upright. "But let's go before I start leaking all over the place." They slipped out into the night, moving quickly but carefully. Elise stayed close, scanning the streets for any sign of pursuit. The city stretched out before them, empty and cold. Then, in the distance, headlights. Too slow for passing cars. Too deliberate. Holt cursed under his breath. "They found us." Elise's pulse spiked. "We need cover." The nearest alley was too narrow, and doubling back would cost them time. The only real option was forward. "Keep moving," Holt ordered. They picked up the pace, but Reeves was struggling. His breathing was heavier, his steps dragging. The headlights closed in. Elise turned sharply, spotting an old service tunnel entrance between 2 buildings. "There." They darted inside, disappearing into the darkness just as the car rolled past. Elise pressed herself against the cold concrete, listening. The car slowed. Stopped. She gritted her teeth. Then, footsteps. They were coming in. Holt raised his gun, and Elise pulled her knife free. The tension in the air was suffocating. A shadow moved at the tunnel entrance. Elise braced herself. Then a voice, low and commanding. "Come out. Now." Langston's men. They weren't leaving without a fight. Elise tightened her grip on the knife, her breath steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. Holt's gun was raised, his finger lightly resting on the trigger as they listened to the slow, measured footsteps echoing off the tunnel walls. Reeves was slumped between them, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. They didn't have time for this. The voice came again, calm and confident. "You've run far enough. Hand it over, and we'll make this easy." Elise exchanged a quick glance with Holt. They both knew that was a lie. Langston's men didn't do easy. Holt gave a slow shake of his head. "Not yet." Elise nodded, shifting slightly against the wall, her back pressed into the damp stone. The tunnel was dark, but not dark enough. If they moved too soon, they'd be exposed. If they waited too long, they'd be cornered. A second set of footsteps joined the first. More men. She could make out 2 silhouettes now, blocking the exit. "We know you have it," the first man continued. "And we know you're hurt. So here's the deal. You dropped the USB. We let you walk away." Holt let out a low chuckle. "You must think we're idiots." A short pause. Then a sigh. "Fine. Have it your way." A gun cocked. Elise moved first. She surged forward, fast and low, knife flashing in the dim light. The first man barely had time to react before she drove the blade into his side, twisting hard. He let out a sharp gasp, his gun firing wild as he stumbled back. Holt took the shot. The second man went down instantly, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Elise yanked her knife free and spun, but the first man was already slumping, his gun slipping from his grasp. Silence. Then, Reeves let out a weak chuckle. "Damn. Remind me not to piss you off." Holt nudged the fallen bodies with his boot, making sure they weren't getting up. "We need to move." Elise wiped the blood off her knife and nodded. The tunnel led further underground, twisting beneath the city. If they kept going, they could surface on the other side, away from Langston's men. She moved to Reeves, looping his arm around her shoulder. He was losing strength fast. Holt led the way, gun still in hand, moving quickly but carefully. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and rusted metal. Water dripped from overhead pipes, the faint sound echoing through the dark passage. Minutes passed. No sign of pursuit. Elise's mind was racing. Langston had to know by now that his men were dead. That meant reinforcements. More guns. More bodies. And they were still trapped underground with an injured man. Ahead, the tunnel curved sharply, ending in a rusted metal grate. Holt moved forward, testing it. It groaned but held. "Damn it," he muttered. Elise shifted Reeves' weight. "We don't have time for locked doors." Holt gave the grate a sharp kick. It rattled but didn't budge. Elise gritted her teeth. Then she spotted a loose hinge near the bottom. "We can force it," she said. "If we—" A distant sound stopped her cold. Voices. Coming from behind them. Holt turned, face set. "They're coming." Elise felt her pulse spike. "Think." She pulled Reeves down against the wall, lowering herself beside him. If they couldn't go forward, they had to make a stand. Holt knelt beside them, checking his magazine. 3 shots left. Elise clenched her jaw. "I've got a knife." Reeves gave a weak smirk. "I'd help, but I'm kind of bleeding out." The footsteps grew closer. Langston's men weren't rushing, they were moving carefully, like they knew their targets were cornered. Elise steadied her grip on the knife. Then, a crash. From above, the grate wrenched open, and a hand shot down. "Move," a voice hissed. Elise didn't hesitate. She shoved Reeves toward the opening. Holt followed, boosting him up. The figure above, tall, broad, wearing a dark hoodie, grabbed Reeves and pulled him through. Elise scrambled up next, gripping the edge as Holt pushed her forward. She swung a leg over and rolled onto solid ground. Holt was the last to climb out, just as the first of Langston's men rounded the tunnel's corner. Gunfire exploded below. The hooded figure slammed the grate shut and dragged a heavy metal crate over it. Elise twisted onto her knees, gasping for breath. They were in a storage yard, surrounded by shipping containers and stacks of metal pallets. A cool wind cut through the night. Reeves groaned beside her, barely conscious. Elise turned to their savior. His hood was still up, shadowing his face. But when he spoke, his voice was low, familiar. "I thought I told you not to get caught." Elise's breath caught. "Jace." The hooded man smirked and pulled his hood back. "Jace Grant. Their old informant. The man they thought had disappeared months ago." Holt let out a dry laugh. "You're supposed to be dead." Jace shrugged. "So are you." Elise pushed herself upright. "How did you find us?" Jace's expression darkened. "Langston's been hunting you hard. He's not letting this go." Elise pulled the USB from her pocket. "That's why we need to finish this." Jace's gaze flickered to it. "Then you'd better move fast." Below them, the metal grate rattled. Langston's men weren't giving up. The night air was thick with tension as Elise, Holt, and Jace moved through the industrial yard, keeping low between the rows of shipping containers. Reeves was barely holding on, his breathing shallow, his weight pressing heavier against Holt as they dragged him forward. The USB drive burned in Elise's pocket. Everything they had fought for, everything Langston wanted to bury, was contained in that small device. They were close now. So close. But Langston's men were closing in fast. Jace moved ahead, his footsteps silent against the concrete. "There's an exit on the far side. Leads to the docks. If we get there, I have a guy who can get us out." Holt's grip tightened on Reeves. "We don't have time for maybe." Jace shot him a sharp look. "I didn't say maybe." Elise swallowed back the doubt creeping into her chest. Jace had saved them once tonight, but she couldn't forget who he used to be, Langston's inside man before he had switched sides. Trusting him now meant trusting that he hadn't gone back. But there wasn't a choice. The distant shouts of Langston's men echoed through the yard. They weren't shooting yet, which meant they wanted them alive. At least for now. Jace turned a corner, then jerked back suddenly. "Shit." Elise pressed against the metal container and peered around him. 4 men, all armed, were stationed by the exit gate. Their escape route was blocked. Holt exhaled sharply. "Figures." Elise checked her knife, the weight of it solid in her grip. "We take them fast." "Silent." Jace held up a hand, then gestured to a small stack of barrels behind the guards. "Give me a second." Before she could ask what he was planning, he disappeared into the shadows. Seconds passed. Then, boom. A deafening explosion erupted from the other side of the yard. The guards snapped to attention, their guns raised as they turned toward the noise. Jace was already moving, slipping through the darkness, a blade glinting in his hand. Elise didn't wait. She lunged forward, her knife sinking into the first man's side before he could turn. Holt took the second, yanking him down with a brutal crack. Jace handled the rest. In less than 30 seconds, the path was clear. Elise wiped the blood from her knife and grabbed Reeves again. "Move." Jace shoved the gate open, and they hurried through, emerging onto the dock. The water stretched ahead, dark and restless beneath the moonlight. A single boat rocked gently at the edge of the pier. Elise's gut tightened. One boat. One last shot at getting out. Jace whistled, and the figure aboard the boat nodded before starting the engine. Holt exhaled. About time. Then, the gunfire started. Langston's men had found them. Bullets tore through the air, ricocheting off the metal railing as they sprinted for the boat. Elise felt the burn of one grazing past her arm, but she didn't stop. Reeves was barely conscious now, his head slumping against Holt's shoulder. Jace reached the boat first, jumping on and pulling Reeves up. Elise shoved Holt forward, turning just in time to see Langston himself step onto the dock. He was calm. Too calm. Elise locked eyes with him across the distance, the gun in his hand steady as he took aim. "You think this ends with a boat ride?" His voice carried over the chaos, smooth and certain. "You'll never be free of this." Elise's grip tightened on her knife. Langston smiled. Then Holt fired. The shot was clean, precise. Langston's body jerked, and he staggered backward, his gun slipping from his grasp. For a moment, he just stood there, as if refusing to believe what had happened. Then he fell. Elise didn't watch him hit the ground. She turned and leaped onto the boat just as it pulled away from the dock, the gunfire fading into the night as the city grew smaller behind them. Jace exhaled, running a hand through his hair. That was a hell of a gamble. Holt dropped onto a bench, wiping the blood from his arm. "Worked, didn't it?" Elise leaned against the railing, the USB still clutched in her palm. Langston was dead, but this wasn't over. The files they had stolen, records of bribes, murders, every crime that had kept Langston's empire standing, were now in their hands. And with Langston gone, every corrupt official he had protected would be scrambling to cover their tracks. Reeves stirred slightly, his voice weak. "We made it." Elise looked out at the open water, the first hints of sunrise breaking on the horizon. "Yeah," she said. "We made it. For now."